The camera swept across the audience. The lights flashed. The music hit its cue. Jimmy Kimmel walked out with his usual grin, quick, polished, just a little smug. He delivered his monologue cleanly. Jokes about headlines. Jabs at politicians. A rhythm the crowd knew how to follow. But he was holding something back. There was a tightness in his voice. A hesitation behind his usual timing. Because tonight's guest wasn't part of the usual rhythm. Karoline Leavitt was waiting backstage. And she wasn't here to play along. Jimmy stepped up to the guest desk. The band quieted. The crowd gave him the polite transition clap. He smiled into the camera and said, "My next guest is Karoline Leavitt, political commentator, former White House staffer, and apparently the reason the internet can't stop talking about necklaces again." Laughter, but lighter than expected. He continued, "She's been making waves after a recent string of interviews where, let's just say, the cross around her neck started getting more airtime than her policies." More laughter. A few groans. The kind of response that doesn't fill a room. It tests it. The stage doors opened. Karoline walked out. She wasn't dressed for debate. She wasn't dressed for applause. She wore a plain, charcoal blazer. Hair pulled back. And just beneath the collarbone, steady, visible, a small silver cross. She didn't wave to the audience. She walked straight to Jimmy, shook his hand, and sat. Jimmy opened fast. "So let's get right to it. You've been in the news a lot lately, but not just for what you've said. People seem more obsessed with what's around your neck." Karoline nodded. "That's usually what happens when the words make people uncomfortable." Jimmy grinned. "Uncomfortable? You're saying the cross is confrontational?" Karoline didn't blink. "I'm saying the cross makes it harder to pretend I showed up to be liked." The audience wasn't sure whether to laugh. They didn't know if she was joking. She wasn't. Jimmy leaned back in his chair. "I mean, it's not exactly subtle. You know how people are. You wear something like that on national television, they're going to talk about it." Karoline said, "Then maybe we should talk about why they're more comfortable with political slogans than with faith." That was the first pause. Not a dramatic one. Just long enough to make Jimmy shift in his seat. He glanced at his notes. "Okay, you're saying this isn't a statement." Karoline replied, "Everything's a statement. But not everything is a stunt." Jimmy chuckled. "That sounds like someone who's been accused of both." She nodded once. "Probably by people who've only ever seen conviction when it's being marketed." The audience was quiet now. Still there. Still watching. But the warmth was gone. Because Karoline wasn't trying to melt the room. She was trying to hold it still. Jimmy tried to reframe. "You've said before that faith informs your politics. Can you see how, in a space like this, people might take that as overreach?" Karoline looked at him carefully. Overreach isn't when someone wears a cross. Overreach is when a room built for opinion gets uncomfortable when belief shows up without apology. That line didn't land. It settled. And no one clapped. No one laughed. They just sat with it. Jimmy said, "You've come into spaces like this before. Late night, liberal audience, comedian host." "What?" Karoline answered. "Because rooms like this believe they already know me. I want them to hear me before they finish writing the punchline." Jimmy Kimmel tapped his pen against his desk once. Lightly. He wasn't flustered. But he was off script now, not in content, but in control. The audience wasn't laughing where it usually did. And Karoline Leavitt hadn't blinked since she sat down. He tried again. "Let's step back. This cross, it's small. It's simple. But the reaction to it was loud. That doesn't strike you as strange." Karoline didn't shift. "It strikes me as familiar." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "Familiar how?" She replied, "Because people like symbols when they can assign the meaning. But when someone wears one that isn't performative, they get nervous." Jimmy smirked. "You think you're making them nervous?" Karoline looked directly at him. "I think I'm making them pay attention." The audience stirred. Not for a laugh. Not for applause. Just a murmur of uncertainty, like they weren't sure whether this was entertainment anymore. Jimmy leaned forward. "So you're saying people feel threatened by faith?" Karoline said, "I'm saying people feel threatened by conviction. And they call it faith when it's the one they don't share." It wasn't a zinger. It wasn't a dunk. It was a sentence that didn't need to raise its voice to land. Jimmy looked at his notes again. But they felt like the wrong language now. He asked, "Do you want to be provocative?" Karoline replied, I want to be honest. If that provokes, maybe the room wasn't ready for truth. A few in the audience clapped. One, maybe two. But the sound didn't spread. Jimmy noticed. He smiled, trying to steer. Okay. So if you came here to speak plainly, let me ask plainly, what does the cross mean to you, sitting here, right now? Karoline answered without pause. It means I have to sit here with dignity, not defensiveness. Because if I believe in something eternal, then I don't need this room to approve of me. The silence after that didn't feel like tension. It felt like air being held. The kind of stillness that makes people realize they're watching something that doesn't care about their response. Jimmy shifted again, this time more visibly. That's a pretty bold thing to say on a comedy show. Karoline replied. Maybe comedy isn't always the room for truth. But truth belongs in the room anyway. The audience didn't laugh, because no one was performing anymore. Jimmy looked to the producers off camera. A flicker of uncertainty. The segment was still live, but the format had dissolved. Jimmy Kimmel glanced toward the side of the stage. He wasn't out of questions, but he was out of rhythm. Karoline Leavitt hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene, but she had turned the segment into something late night wasn't built to hold. And now, the control room had to decide what to do. One of the producers leaned in behind the curtain. Wrap it. The lead producer shook her head. No. Ease her out. Don't frame it as a cut. Just transition. The message reached Jimmy's earpiece in a few seconds. He adjusted his posture, glanced at his notes, then looked at Karoline. All right, we're short on time, he said. Before you go, final thought. Why wear the cross, knowing the reaction it would get? Karoline didn't smile, didn't soften. She said, because it's not for them, and it's not for you. It's for me, to remember who I am when I sit in rooms that expect me to perform something smaller. No one clapped, not because they disagreed, but because it didn't feel like a line. It felt like the end of a sentence that didn't need punctuation. Jimmy nodded, tried to rap with charm. Karoline Leavitt, everyone. Political commentator, truth teller, and apparently, late-night cross-bearer. A few laughs. One chuckle too loud. Then music. The camera cut wide. And Karoline stood, microphone already being removed by a quiet hand from the crew. She left the stage without looking back. No confrontation. No handshake. No final quote. Just exit. Because she had brought something the room didn't expect. And refused to shrink it just to fit the frame. The episode aired the next night without changes. No disclaimer. No voiceover. No commentary from Jimmy Kimmel before or after. Just the segment, untouched. 31 minutes from handshake to exit. The conversation didn't explode. It didn't bend. It simply refused to entertain. The online reaction was immediate, but uneven. Some said she hijacked the format. Others said she brought dignity into a space that didn't know how to hold it. One headline read, Karoline Leavitt weaponizes faith on Kimmel. Another, quietly viral, said, she didn't weaponize anything. She just didn't hand it over. Clips spread fast, but not the kind with bold captions or cutaways. The clips were long, unclipped, people sharing the entire thing with captions like, watch until the end. No one raised their voice. That's what made it work. In the writer's room the next morning, no one made jokes about it. One writer asked, did we lose control? Another replied, no. We lost the assumption that she came to play. Jimmy said nothing. He stared at his note cards from the night before, still on his desk, still creased from where his thumb had pressed them. Then he said, we invited her in. She brought a mirror. We just didn't like what we saw. Karoline gave no post-interview statement. She didn't tweet, didn't repost, didn't clarify. When asked by a reporter for comment, her spokesperson responded with one line. Not everything needs follow-up. Sometimes the stillness says enough. A week later, no one was talking about it on air. The blogs had moved on. The think pieces slowed. But something lingered. Not in headlines, in conversations. Quiet ones. Private ones. In a college classroom, a professor paused a lecture and asked, did anyone watch that Leavitt segment last week? A few students nodded. One said, I thought it would be political. It wasn't. It was something else. Another added, I didn't agree with her, but I couldn't stop watching. She wasn't defending anything. She was just there. In a church lobby in Ohio, Two women replayed the moment on a phone between them. They didn't talk about policies. They didn't even use her name. One simply said, "I've never seen someone sit like that and not flinch." In a newsroom, a junior editor kept the tab open all week. Not because she needed to write about it, because she didn't want to forget it. She said to a friend over coffee, there was no scandal, no blow-up, just someone who didn't need the room to clap in order to stay whole. Jimmy Kimmel didn't reference it again. Not on air, not in interviews. But during a rehearsal for a later episode, a producer handed him a cue card with a guest's bio on it. He glanced at the name, then asked, "Do they know what kind of room they're walking into?" The producer replied, "Yeah, but maybe the room's still adjusting." 3 weeks later, the segment stopped circulating, but people were still talking about it. Not in headlines, not in comments, in quiet conversations that never made it online. A father showed it to his teenage daughter. She asked, why didn't she explain more? He answered, because she didn't need them to understand. She needed to stay honest. At a book event, a moderator asked Karoline, "Do you think the moment on Kimmel mattered?" She paused, then said, "Only if you think clarity matters more than applause." There was no follow-up, because the answer didn't need one. In an interview months later, Jimmy Kimmel was asked, "What was the most uncomfortable moment on your show this year?" He didn't hesitate. The one where someone came in unshakable and left just as still. The host laughed softly, then said, "It wasn't a clash. It was a refusal to shrink." The network moved on. The viewers moved on. But somewhere inside that studio, someone printed a still image from the interview. Karoline seated, hands calm, cross visible. They pinned it quietly in the corner of a producer's wall. Not labeled, not spotlighted, just remembered.